Hi friends, this is Sarvajam here. Welcome to my networking channel. Hope all are doing good. And today the topic I am going to discuss about how to configure redistribution between RIP and OSPF routing protocol in Fortigate firewall. For that I connected three different firewall 1, 2 and 3. So all three are Fortigate firewall. And between firewall 1 and 2 I am going to configure RIP as a routing protocol. And between firewall 2 and 3 I am going to configure OSPF as a routing protocol, and firewall 2 will be the border router which is capable of redistributing between RIP and OSPF and OSPF and RIP. So firewall 1 and 2 I am going to configure in this particular subnet. Firewall 2 and 3 I am going to configure in this particular subnet. So first let us define the directly connected interfaces for firewall 1, 2 and 3. Then let us configure the routing protocol RIP between firewall 1 and 2, OSPF between firewall 2 and 3. And the second part is I need to configure the redistribution in border router. Okay, between RIP and OSPF and RIP. And the final configuration I will be configuring the policy configuration. So now let us go one by one. First let us define the interfaces on all this firewall. Okay, so this is port 1 and this will be port 2. Okay, so first let us configure the port with the corresponding interfaces. Okay, so let us log into the first firewall. Okay, so for defining the interfaces there is a we can configure via script if you want to define multiple interfaces. So this is the easiest way we can configure. So the command is config system interface edit port 1 and the mode should be static. Okay, set mode static and the set IP. Since I am assigning a static IP 192.168.1.1/24 and I am going to allow the ping access. So just copy it and paste it on the first firewall. So because the first firewall has only one directly interfaces in the subnet 1.0, so this IP is 1.1. Okay, so go here, just copy it and save the configuration. So now let us view the interface. Show system interface port 1. Okay, this is the IP. And now let us configure the second firewall as two interfaces. This is 1.2 and this will be 2.1. So let us define both these interfaces. Then we'll go to the third firewall. Okay, so let us configure the interface accordingly. So the first interface will be 2.1, that is port 1. Okay, this one is port 1 and port 2 will be 2.1. So the port 1 this interface 1.2, port 2 this interface is 2.1. Okay, so this is 1.2 and the second interface is 2.1. Only they need to change the port value. Port is 2. So that these are the only changes I'm going to do. Just quickly copy it and paste it. Just copy this and paste it on the second firewall. So just paste it, save the configuration and copy the second command. This for port 2. Okay, just paste it and save the configuration. So now let us view the configuration, that is show system interface port 1. This is for port 1 1.2 this interface and port 2 interface is 2.1. Okay, so we are done with the configuration and the third part is third firewall interface IP is 2.2. This interface is 2.2. So let us define that 2.2 and the port is port 2. So config system interface edit port 2, set mode is static and the IP. Just copy it and paste it on the third firewall. Let us log in and paste it and save the configuration. So before configuring prior to the configuration of routing protocol RIP and OSPF, first let us check the directly connected interface. Let us ping the remote interface and let us confirm the connectivity. Then we'll configure the RIP as a routing protocol. So execute. So ping and the remote interface, let us ping 192.168.1.2. I'm able to reach. Okay, so now let us ping from here to this interface 2.1. So execute ping 192.168.2.1. So I'm able to do the check the ping connectivity. So now the second step is I'm going to configure the RIP as a routing protocol between firewall 1 and 2 and OSPF as a routing protocol between firewall 2 and 3. So RIP configuration is pretty simple through a command line. So what is the command is config router RIP So the RIP, there are two things you have to define. First, you have to enable the RIP on this interface, and the second thing, we need to advertise this prefix. So these are the two things as far as RIP protocol is concerned. Okay, so config interface and which port I'm going to enable. So I'm going to enable on port 1. Okay, port 1 is added, then save the configuration. Now I'm going to advertise this prefix. So for that, the statement is config network. Okay, edit 1. So edit 1 is nothing but I'm adding the first entry and I'm going to advertise the prefix. So set prefix, the prefix value 192.168.1.0/24, that's subnet, and save the configuration. Okay, so we have done with the RIP configuration between firewall 1 and 2. So this particular port I have completed. So now between firewall 2 and 1 I need to configure, right? So let us check the configuration. Show system interface port 1. So this will show the port configuration. Show router RIP. So this will show the RIP configuration. So what we have done, config router RIP, config network, and we have advertised this prefix. Additionally, what we have done, we have enabled the routing RIP interface on this particular port, RIP protocol on this particular interface, that is port 1. Now let us quickly jump to the second firewall and let us configure the RIP configuration. Similar configuration, right? So go to second firewall, config router RIP. Okay, config interface, and the port is again port 1. So I'm going to configure RIP only between firewall 1 and 2. So this port 1. Okay, and now save the configuration and let us advertise the network. Config network edit 1. I'm going to add the prefix. Set prefix as 192.168.1.0/24 and save the configuration. So now we have successfully enabled the RIP routing protocol between firewall 1 and 2. So okay, so how we can check it is, now we can check via get router info RIP. We can check also interface port 1. So we enable RIP on this particular interface, that is port 1, and similar way you are able to see the port is up and the line protocol is up and the routing protocol is RIP. Okay, you are able to see send and receive the RIP packets. Similar way, let us check for the second firewall. So this also the RIP protocol is enabled. So now let us enable the OSPF as a routing protocol between firewall 2 and 3. Okay, so then we'll configure the redistribution. Let us go to firewall 2 and 3. Okay, so the command is config router OSPF. In case of OSPF, I have to set the router ID. So let us here set the router ID as 2.2.2 and here as 3.3.3. Okay, so set the router ID as 2.2.2. Okay, and now I need to define the area. So I'm going to define both this particular firewall in area 0, that is a backbone area. So config area followed by, we have to add the area. So this is a backbone area, it is added. So now only one more thing is pending. Just like RIP, I need to advertise a prefix. So only difference is OSPF, we have to define the router ID and we have to configure the area. Now I have to define the prefix. So config network edit 1, add the first entry and advertise the prefix. So here the prefix will be this prefix. Okay, so 192.168.2.0/24. Okay, save the configuration. So we are done with the OSPF on this particular interface. Now let us enable the OSPF configuration from firewall 3. Okay, so let us go to firewall 3 and let us enable the OSPF configuration. So config router OSPF. I hope you are following this. And then we have to define the router ID. So let us set it as 3.3.3. Okay, set the router ID 3.3.3. Then let us define it in backbone area. Config area edit 0.0.0.0. Save the configuration. Then let us advertise this prefix. Okay, so config network edit 1, add the entry first entry and set the prefix 192.168.2.0/24 and save the configuration. So now we have successfully enabled the OSPF as a routing protocol between firewall 2 and 3 Now let us check the OSPF neighbor relationship and the OSPF routes. Okay, so let us go to firewall 2. So the command is get router info OSPF neighbor. So you're able to see already the neighbor is established. Okay, so let us go here to the third router and check the things. I'm able to see and get router OSPF neighbor I'm able to see. Okay, so now what is the thing I'm going to do is we enable the routing protocol RIP and OSPF. So now the second part is we need to configure the redistribution. So always the border router is capable of redistributing between RIP and OSPF and RIP. So now let us enable the redistribution and let us now check the routing entries on firewall 1 and firewall 3. So OSPF so firewall 1 we have to see the OSPF routes, redistributed OSPF routes, and firewall 3 I have to see the RIP routes. Okay, so let us go to firewall 2 and let us enable the redistribution. Config router RIP, which is very simple, config router RIP and config redistribute OSPF. Okay, then we have to enable it. So let us command is set status enable. Okay, so I enabled it. Now let us save the configuration. Okay, so RIP from RIP protocol OSPF I redistributed RIP and also go to config router OSPF. Now redistribute RIP. The same command config redistribute RIP. This is a command. Then we have to enable the redistribution. Set status enable. Okay, so now we are done with the redistribute configuration. Now let us check the routing entries from firewall 1 and 3. Okay, let us go to firewall 1. So get router info routing table all. So still I am not able to see the OSPF routes in RIP, and let us check from OSPF end. Get router info routing table all. So you have to see the remote entries, that is the RIP routes you have to see in OSPF, and OSPF routes you have to see in this particular firewall 1. Still I am not able to see. Why? Because still we have to redistribute the connected routes. So the command is go to the border firewall and go to config router OSPF. One more command is pending, that is config redistribute connected. So you have to enable the connected routes and set the status as enable. So just enable it. That means I'm advertising the connected routes also. Just save the configuration. Now similar way let us go to RIP routes. Okay, config router RIP. Okay, now let us redistribute the connected routes. Config redistribute connected. Set the status as enable. Hope you're following. Config router OSPF, redistribute connected and set the status as enable. Similar way do it for routing protocol RIP also. Now save the configuration. How to view the configuration is show router RIP. So you can see here the config, you can see in the RIP protocol we have to we enable the connected routes and also we have redistributed the OSPF. Similar way for OSPF also we can check. So OSPF also we are able to see we have configured, these are the basic things. Then we have enabled the connected routes and also we have redistributed the RIP also. Okay, so now let us check the routing entries. So RIP should see the OSPF routes and here also you have to see the routes. Okay, so go here and now you are able to see the remote network, right? 192.168.2. network in the RIP routing database, you are able to see that, right? 192.168.2.0. and similar way let us check from firewall 3 also. Get router info routing table all. So now you are able to see these particular RIP routes are advertised as an external route in OSPF database. In the OSPF routing table, advertised as OE2, that means it's an external entry. So now let us try to ping the remote network. 192.168.2. sorry, it is 1.1. Still I am not able to reach the remote interface from this particular firewall. Why? Because still the one more thing is pending. As I told previously, we have to configure a policy for allowing from this particular port 1 to port 2 and port 2 to port 1. Then only you can do the ping communication between this firewall 3 and firewall 1. You are not able to ping, right? Similarly, let us go to firewall 1. Okay, so do execute ping remote interfaces 192.168.2.1. also I'm not able to reach, and 2.2. So that means I would create two policy. First policy is for two firewall policy. first policy for allowing from port 1 to port 2 communication, and the second policy is for port 2 to port 1 communication. Okay, so let us quickly configure the policy in the border router. Configure firewall policy, edit one. I'm adding the first entry. Set source interface, let us make it as port 1, and the destination interface as port 2, and source address, let us define it as all. You can give the specific address. In this particular thing, I'm going to define as all, and set destination address as all. So these are the parameters you have to always set for defining the firewall policy. Source interface, destination interface, source address, destination address, then what schedule. Schedule should be always I'm defining, and the action should be accept. Okay, I'm accepting the packets. Then set the service. You want to define any specific service, or you want to define or any ICMP service, or in this particular thing I'm going to define the service as all. So the first policy I completed. This is for allowing from port 1 to port 2 communication. Similar configuration I need to do for the second policy from port 2 to port 1. So how to view the policy? Show firewall policy. Okay, so let us copy this. So this remains similar for the second policy also. Let us copy this. Okay, so now let us add a second entry. Config firewall policy edit 2. This for adding a second entry. So now I'm going to allow the communication from port 2 to port 1. Okay, so set source interface as port 2, and set destination interface as port 1. Set. Okay, now let us copy it. Remaining all are same. Okay, so I set all these to a default value. Just save the configuration. So now let us see the firewall policy. So there are two policy from port 1 to port 2 communication, and port 2 to port 1 communication. So we have successfully added the policy. So now I should be in a position to ping from this firewall 1 to this remote interface. Okay, 2.2, and 2. This particular firewall 3 to this remote 1.1. Okay, let us now ping. So previously you are not able to ping, now let us ping. So now I am successfully able to ping only because of the policy, right? I enabled the policy. Now let us check from firewall 3 to firewall 1. That interface is 1.1. Let us ping the interface. So 1.1 is also I am able to reach, and 1.1 and 1.2 also. So the command you have to keep it in mind is get router info OSPF for viewing the OSPF information, and for viewing the routing table it is routing table all. So get router info routing table all. Okay, and also in the first router the command is get router info routing table all. You can see the redistributed routes. So here you can see the redistributed routes. OSPF routes are successfully redistributed into RIP, and RIP routes are successfully redistributed as an external route into OSPF routing database. Okay, so I hope you understand this video. So the what are things we have done is we have configured the directly connected interfaces on all this firewall. Then the second thing, we have configured the RIP as a routing protocol between firewall 1 and 2, OSPF as a routing protocol between firewall 2 and 3, and then we have defined the redistribution configuration in firewall 2, that is a border router, and finally we have defined the policy for the communication purpose. And I hope you enjoy this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more videos. Thanks, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.